Good evening, Justin. We are talking on a very auspicious day, and that is the day before the January 6th hearings.
Yeah, the first hearings, which have been long awaited, there's been a lot of work put into them, are going to happen Thursday, tomorrow at 8 p.m. Eastern. So we're going to get our first somewhat comprehensive look from the bipartisan committee to investigate the coup attempt on January 6th tomorrow.
Yeah, I suppose by the time that this conversation releases, the first hearings will have already happened. So anyone who's listening will be able to tell whether we were right, wrong, off base, or right on target with our expectations.
Totally. And what we're going to do here for the audience is this will be a running series of sort that we will just continue to update as the hearings progress, as more information comes out, maybe lawsuits, criminal suits. But what I'd want to do today, John, is first outline why this is serious, why this is not a partisan issue, why it's an American issue, and then move from there down to some of the more specific things that happened, the events on January 6th leading up to January 6th, and then the aftermath. So for me, I think it's important that we start out with what a Washington National Football League coach tweeted out, actually mentioned today in a statement where he compared the violence on January 6th. He called it a dust up, and then compared it to the protests and riots over the summer for George Floyd and police justice.
So, Justin, this is the defensive coordinator from the Washington Commanders NFL team, right? I think his name is Alex Del Rio. Is that correct?
Jack Del Rio.
Jack Del Rio. Okay.
He's a staunch Republican, but that's not the point. The point isn't to compare two bad things. Property destruction during the protests in the summer for social justice was not a good thing. It's just unequivocally, everybody on both sides of the aisle can condemn that. But what happened during January 6th was unequivocally much worse because it's literally an existential threat to democracy. And honestly, the way the Republican Party has responded in basically whitewashing it, if not condoning it, pretty damn close, makes me sick. And it's the greatest threat that I think our democracy has faced potentially ever from the inside. To me, it's a worse threat than Richard Nixon and Watergate and a lot of other things, just because of how feckless and timid the Republican Party was. So, John, for me, January 6th can be broken down into two things. One, an actual legitimate violent coup attempt that happened on that day that was created by a lead up to January 6th by the rhetoric used by President Trump and his cronies. And then second, the white collar crime that was committed, very likely committed, we're going to find out in January 6th in the DOJ trials that are coming up, to overthrow the election by providing a fake slate of electorates, to have Mike Pence not certify the electoral count, and to use a lot of other tricks that are, quite frankly, illegal. So just to put a fine point on this for me, I don't need to go into it further, but I'd love to hear your perspective. Trump attempted a coup, and as a result of Trump attempting the coup, the Republican Party did not convict him of impeachment. And now, 2 years later, a year and a half later, they are actively beginning to whitewash this, calling the investigation partisan and something that Americans don't need to pay attention to. So for me, the Republican Party is committing a continued and direct assault on U.S. democracy.
Yeah, I think that that's pretty much correct, Justin. I think that a lot of the job of the January 6th committee and the hearings and public presentations that they are beginning tomorrow is to try to draw the connection between these two different spheres. On one hand, that, as you described it, the white collar side of the attempt to overturn the election, people in suits in offices with legal arguments and bureaucratic machinations, and then the violence of the day itself. For many observers, these two things probably look quite discrete. However, they are very closely connected. The violent attack that happened on the Capitol was as the direct consequence of these efforts to overturn the election through other means. It was almost the coup of last resort. And it's very significant that people in the public and our legislators understand the connection between the different areas of conduct here. I think that something that I want to draw attention to has to do with the word that you use when you describe that white collar side of affairs, and that's the word crime. And I think that it's a difficult thing to grapple with, but what we have to understand when it comes to these bureaucratic and administrative injustices is that often there are not statutory laws on the books that deal specifically with the conduct that we're considering. We found this problem in many other times throughout the Trump presidency and also through other presidencies. But there is a paucity of actually written law dealing with some of the administrative abuses that figures in our government might carry out. And I think that often those who try to make excuses for that conduct draw a red line around the criminal code and say, well, the test for whether you've done something wrong is whether you've broken a law that's on the books. And I think that this is really the wrong way to understand government and really ethics and morality in public life in general, because the moral code of humanity is not the US criminal code. You can do things that are unethical, that are immoral, that are dangerous, that don't break a law that's on the books. And we should never use that as our standard for determining whether someone has acted appropriately. There aren't many laws that are written about what a president can and cannot do. It's not an area in which it was necessary to specify the exact criminal lines that can and cannot be crossed. There's really almost no precedent of prosecuting people in those positions at all. There have been governors and judges who have been prosecuted. There's never been a president who's been prosecuted with a crime at all. So we don't have any case law really about what a president can or can't do. So we can't really rely on that when we try to determine what was appropriate and what was profoundly dangerous, immoral, and destructive to our institutions. Instead, we have to rely on something else.
Yeah, and that's really the danger here, John. Just hearkening it back to the actual violent insurrection, violent coup, where at least 5 people died. And they were chanting, just for listeners, they were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." There are reports that President Trump was very pleased that that was happening. I am certain that that will come out during these January 6th hearings. If folks remember, the coup happened over a long period of time. It was hours and hours that it happened, where the perimeter was breached. They broke into the chamber. They chased lawmakers out. They prevented the official duty of the Capitol from being done. And it took 3 or 4 hours for President Trump to come out and say, "Please stop, go home." And even in doing so, he said they were very fine people that he loved, I believe was along those lines. But John, to your point, there is this legal gray area based on precedent, right? It's actually probably pretty straightforward when somebody's trying to do a coup and it does break some certain laws that we already have in the books, that's probably illegal. But in that gray area is how the messaging against January 6th, to whitewash January 6th, is going to take place, not only during these hearings, but we already heard it after the coup itself. You have folks like Tucker Carlson saying, basically, because it wasn't an organized militia, and actually it could have been with the Proud Boys, which we can get into, but because it wasn't something that we see with these people carrying automatic weapons and going in, killing hundreds of people, that it wasn't a coup. But coups don't usually happen that way. They are slow to take place. It's a tipping point of emotion, of people, and then all of a sudden you're in it. And what we witnessed was unequivocally a coup, but because we've never seen anything like it, similar to the law point that you brought up, people on the other side were trying to detract from it. The freaks like Glenn Greenwald and Tucker Carlson, the mendacious liars like Jim Jordan, Jim Banks, and other MAGA Freedom Caucus members, Marjorie Taylor Greene. And I'm concerned that we are going to see much more of the same. Not only am I concerned about how the GOP is going to react, I'm concerned, John, that this may not resonate with the public. Because to me, I don't know about you, but to me, this is the most important policy issue. This is the most important political issue. This is how I will vote. As long as there is a majority of insurrectionists or people who will whitewash the insurrection in the GOP, I will never vote for them, period, full stop.
I think that many or most people in the US public understand that this is important. I think that there's often panicking about the people that are unreachable and frustration that not 100% of the US body politic will come around to a particular point of view. But that will never happen on any issue. And I think that we should stop pulling our hair out over our inability to reach the 10% of absolute extremists that exist within the United States or in any other country. I think that the hearings can still do important work of communicating to many of the rest of us, the regional people in the American public, about the significance of the events of that day and the 2 months and 3 months that precipitated it. And I believe that they can also help draw a lot of these lines more clearly, the connection between these different events. I think also there's going to be new information that they've uncovered that they'll be presenting, things that we'll be learning about for the first time. But of course, many people in the American public do not have the time and capacity to follow everything very closely. And I think that the committee are going to have to be very careful about how much information they present. And then interpreters in the news media will also have to be careful about how much information that they present through their own filter, because the more complex the story is, the harder it becomes to really understand. And that is why there has been so much focus on the actual physical violence of that day, because it's the clearest image. And it's so straightforward for anybody to be able to draw moral lines around that, understand what it is. There's a couple of things that you said, Justin, that I kind of wanted to respond to. The first is the matter of organized militias. So my understanding is that the DOJ do, in fact, believe that there was an organized militia element involved in this attack. And they've begun escalating some of their prosecutions by charging the leaders of some of these militia groups with higher levels of crime than they previously had. So rather than just charging them for vandalism or trespassing or assault, they've charged, for example, just this week, Enrique Tarrio, the head of the Proud Boys, with seditious conspiracy. So that's the idea that he was involved in planning and organizing with other people the attack. So there does seem to be a militia element involved.
An attack on the U.S. government to interrupt business, right?
Yeah, indeed. Something that would interfere with the functions of the U.S. government, which is what this entire thing was really about.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to clarify that. I know that a lot of people on the right, like Glenn and Tucker, were saying for months, but nobody's been charged with seditious conspiracy. So just to dig into that a little bit, what does that mean, seditious conspiracy? Does that mean this guy was acting alone? Does that mean he was acting with a group of people? You mentioned militia. Can you just go a little bit deeper for me, why this is so significant rather than just a couple freaks being charged with something that sounds very serious?
I think that it's important to understand how criminal investigations are conducted. And I have to be very clear that criminal investigations are not the kinds of investigations that the January 6th committee in the US Congress are engaged in. So I hope that this is very clear to anybody who's listening, who's trying to follow this story. But you've got multiple investigations that are happening in parallel. The investigation that we're primarily talking about tonight, that will be the focus of news headlines this week, is the investigation that's being conducted by the House, the US House of Representatives. They're doing a congressional investigation. So these investigations are meant to have a legislative purpose. You uncover facts so that you can apply those facts in how you write future laws. So it's not about trying to find people who violated criminal statutes. It's about trying to understand all the events of that day so that we can pass new laws that will shore up our election infrastructure and the Capitol security and so on, ethics laws for the administration, to prevent this sort of thing from happening again. At the same time, the executive branch of government, the DOJ inside the Biden administration, are engaged in a criminal investigation. So this is an investigation that is not making moral judgments like the ones that I was making earlier. This is one that's interested entirely in matters of the law and whether statutes have been broken. So again, this is not the barometer for morality. This is something else. It's measuring the actions of people taken against what is on the U.S. criminal code. And so the way that these kinds of investigations are usually conducted is the prosecutors and the FBI, the investigatory teams, go after the lowest people on the food chain first. If you're investigating a big conspiracy, first you go for the foot soldiers. And you get convictions or guilty pleas of these people. And then you turn them into witnesses. And you get them to tell you about what the people one step above them might have done. And then see if you can flip any of those people. If you can get a conviction, you can offer a lower sentence in a cooperation deal. You can do that even before a trial through a plea deal. You get them to provide evidence about the people one step higher above the chain. And so for the whole first year of this investigation, almost all of the focus was on those foot soldiers, the people who physically attacked the US Capitol. and getting convictions of many, many of these people, dozens and dozens of, I don't know the exact number, but it was many, many more people than I was able to keep track of. And just like you said, Justin, people like Glenn Greenwald and others were saying, look, it's small ball stuff. We're only getting people who broke minor laws. Some of these are just misdemeanor charges. It's nothing. What they didn't realize was what was going to come next, or what they weren't preparing the public for in their rhetoric, was what was coming next, which was this shift that I mentioned, that instead of now just charging those foot soldiers, we've moved to the people one step higher above the chain and are in fact charging the organizers of the militia groups. So it does make you curious about where this could eventually go. I think it's very important that we don't start moving too much into speculation and setting expectations in an unreachable place. So this is eventually going to reach Donald Trump, who was the president. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is we are seeing that DOJ are being very methodical here, and they are committed to following their playbook, which is start small and move up. And they're already starting to move up.
Of course, anybody following this shouldn't need much more proof than what they saw leading up to January 6th, first off, whether it was in November after the election, December after the election. You had the president of the United States pushing the big lie. So that's completely reprehensible. Then on January 6th, you have this violent attack. Not only that, though, after the violent attack, you had members of the House of Representatives on the Republican side, members of the U.S. Senate that were Republicans, not only vote to impeach him, and there was a sizable number of Republican senators that voted to impeach him, you had Mitch McConnell, the literal, I guess you could say, standard bearer or embodiment of the institutional establishment, what was the establishment GOP, come out on the Senate floor and explicitly blame this on former President Trump. He, I believe, called it an insurrection. He condemned it. I don't think the audience or any of the general public should necessarily be watching this with popcorn and bated breath and expect that from the January 6th hearings that they're going to be able to catch Trump red-handed, nor do I think that that is the purpose of these hearings. I think the purpose of these hearings is to not only push back a little bit on the lies and whitewashing of the GOP and folks like Tucker and the propaganda machine, but also to set the historical record, to say we've done a thorough and full accounting of what happened on the 6th and leading up to the 6th. This is what we believe to happen based on the objective and impartial information that we've received. They're going to put it in the congressional record. They're going to televise it so that generations to come, whether our democracy is only able to survive 20 or 30 more years because the insurrection wing of the GOP ultimately takes over the party, or whether it's to survive a few hundred more years, so that future generations can look at what went wrong and hopefully be able to avoid it in the future. So, John, that's what I find the value of these January 6th hearings. It's a full and honest, transparent accounting so that in the future generations, whether it's us or people after we're long dead, can look at what happened and prevent it from happening in the future. Where do you see the value of these hearings?
Something that you said got me thinking a little bit, and you're talking about the survival of the regime, essentially, right? The U.S. constitutional system. And we found that it was in a more precarious place than we realized. And I think that that's a really important thing to recognize, because we've come to assume the persistence of the regime. And that's not really a safe assumption. If you think about the way that politics work all over the world, you understand that regimes, constitutional systems, are often very short-lived. In the amount of time that we've had just one, France have had, I think, 17 different regimes. They've had revolutions, they've had monarchies that have come and gone and that have been reinstated and taken out again. They've had 5 different republics. They had the Vichy regime in France. It's not ordinary for a system like ours to last as long as it has. Just in Mali, they've had, I think, 3 coups in the last 2 years. This is really the norm of how politics operate throughout history and throughout the world.
And just to really harp on that, right? People think of Rome as this great 1,000-year empire. However, Rome had multiple regimes. Largely, there were 2 very distinct ones, right?
Oh, yeah, certainly. Yeah, the Republic and then the Roman Empire. Yeah.
But Rome was still a great empire before the Great Roman Empire. It was the Republic and the dictators.
Well, and more than that too, because when they shifted the capital to Istanbul,
of course,
split it into Eastern Western Empire, and Western Empire fell. More and more regimes. I think that January 6th reminded us how precarious the survival of our system actually is, and we can't take it for granted.
And it's really important. We're not crying wolf here. We're not saying the sky is falling, the sky is falling. This is legitimate. No regime is everlasting. At some point, this American Constitution, form of government, will fail. You can quote great philosophers. Great philosopher Montesquieu, who's the grandfather of our Constitution, created the checks and balances, first one to outline them most articulately, says nothing survives longer than 500 years in a form of government. So when we're looking at this, technology is advancing, polarization is happening. We have 24-hour news, which has completely changed everything. The senators and members of the House of Representatives, John, for hundreds of years, for the vast majority of our founding, used to live most consistently in Washington, D.C. They used to dine together, Republicans and Democrats alike. They had much more interaction. They were getting news from similar sources. There were only a few main news sources in the country. And things, despite vacillating, we almost lost it with a civil war, but still, DC functioned, I would argue, much better than it does today. The filibuster is relatively, the way they use it, you tell me all the time, it's relatively new. But this is all to say that everybody needs to understand the reason why I am so disgusted with the Republican Party is we had Charles C.W. Cook on from the National Review, very conservative columnist, and he out and out admitted that the Republican Party has a collective action problem that the Democratic Party does not have. I'm not saying the Democratic parties are all roses and sunshine, but what I'm saying is, looking at things right now, it is much less likely that a wannabe despot, or for other people, a wannabe malevolent dictator is able to gain power in the Democratic Party and then use that power to end our system just because the Democrats are more individual. They're going to step up and work together to prevent this awful type of thing from happening. So that is a very important thing, John, that I think we need to focus on, because as these January 6th hearings unfold, the people on the other side of the spectrum that will be held up by Fox News and the Republican Party are some of the legitimate worst actors that not only don't care if this happened, but literally egged it on.
The question of what would happen if someone in the Democratic Party tried doing what Donald Trump tried to do is a strange one, because it's just completely hypothetical and it has no real answer. Whereas it's opposite, it's inverse. We know exactly what would happen because it did. I mean, it's strange to compare a hypothetical with a fact. The fact is the important thing to focus on, isn't it? And the fact of the matter is that Donald Trump did try to overthrow the U.S. constitutional system. And he was a Republican, and we know the way the Republicans reacted to all this. And it was not proud the way that they did. And you know what I think is remarkable is that really the lack of action from the Republican Party towards this emergency, it really reflects a lack of confidence in a way that's very disappointing, because the Republican Party did not seem to think that they had any ability to reckon with the truth of this threat to our system and survive politically. They're so terrified of these mass of supporters for Donald Trump that they perceive, that they don't believe that they have real ability to survive the necessary reckoning. And I wonder if this is accurate, because as an observer, it seems to me like the Republican Party are in a pretty strong place on a lot of the fundamental matters in our politics. They have huge advantages given their strength with rural voters in the US Senate and thus the Electoral College. The economic circumstances were inevitably going to give them a pretty strong position going into the 2022 elections. There is the famous pendulum effect in US politics. No party has been able to establish a permanent majority. Certainly not since the era of good feelings back in the early 19th century. The two parties oscillate between ones in power constantly.
And they're largely winning the culture wars. The parents wanted their kids in school well before they were put into school in blue and purple states because of COVID. And then not only that, you have Democrats like AOC and the progressives, and moderates, John, in Washington, D.C., I work with a bunch, are bullshit about the way that the progressives have taken the party in this cultural messaging. They're using terms like Latinx, which I think 4% of Hispanic, Latino, Latina voters support, and the rest don't, but they're using it because it's gender neutral. And then that gets into a whole other case of things where, regardless if you agree with the Democrats on this messaging or not, the American public is not behind them. And those are the main issues that we're talking about: the economy, the electoral structure between the electoral college and the royal makeup, and then social issues.
Yeah, I mean, the Republican Party have a set of issues that they pull strongly on. Some of them, in my opinion, I don't believe they deserve to. Others, perhaps they do.
Same.
But certainly they have an ability to reach a lot of the electorate. And it's really disappointing that they don't think that they can stand up to a television personality who's trying to overthrow the government. As we know from the reporting that's been conducted by Jonathan Martin, for example, by Susan Glasser, we know the way that Kevin McCarthy, Mitch McConnell, and other key people in the GOP reacted to January 6th. And it really was much the way that they reacted to much of the whole Trump phenomenon, which was outraged and discussed privately. The things that they say behind closed doors are almost exactly what's being said on MSNBC about Donald Trump. This is the way that they really feel. And at certain times, they felt very comfortable expressing this, even to the entire GOP congressional caucuses. However, there is this paralysis in the way that they interact with the public on these topics. And what I think it is their instinct to try to thread the needle. They want to try to steer things in the direction they prefer, move forward, but do so without disrupting that sizable, but not enormous, base of committed Trump supporters that will be helpful for them in elections. And they believe that they can abdicate their responsibility to eliminate Trump from our politics and allow others to take up, the charge of doing so, and that we can all move on from this chapter. And, really the instinct to move on and move forward, I think, is a positive one in some respects. But it's one that they could have embraced even more fully if they had taken the step of voting to convict Donald Trump and eliminating him from elected office in the future. Because really the sword of Damocles that's hanging over all of this is the latent threat that he will run for president again. And that's something we haven't even talked about. Whether or not he's going to do so, his suggestion that he might is enough to put the fear of God into these figures in the Republican Party.
You mentioned them talking. Mitch McConnell, John, said it on the Senate floor during the impeachment, right? So it's
that's
like
true. That's true.
They've come out and said it. To your point, I agree. They're putting expediency ahead of what's actually healthy and best for the country. They're putting not party ahead of it. They're putting their own elections ahead of it. It's more craven than that because it's rotting the party from the inside out. But I don't know if they could have necessarily survived as easily as we're potentially positing. So let's say Trump was impeached. Let's say they vote to convict. If he's convicted, all of a sudden, you've probably just removed the energy from 10 to 15% of the Republican voters. They may not even come out to vote for Trump. And if they do come out to vote for these people, you're going to have a lot more potential crazies in the House, I would argue, like the Lauren Boeberts, like the Marjorie Taylor Greens. And then when they don't come out and vote, you potentially end up with Democratic supermajorities. So I think from their perspective, they're all looking at it individually. And the only ones who voted in the Senate to impeach him were people that were retiring, weren't up until 2024, 2026, or were safe anyways. The ultimate thing is they all made the calculation that the country is not worth them losing their seat. And I think that they were probably politically made the right calculation.
I think a lot of listeners might object to the fact that we are talking about this situation through the lens of elections and partisan politics. But what I would say is that the reason that we're doing so is because we're trying to get inside the mind of people who matter and have the ability to affect these outcomes. And that's the Republicans in the US Congress, especially in the Senate. And what matters to them is what we're talking about now, this electoral calculus. And what I think deserves some questioning is whether their assessment is even really correct. And like I said before, I think the rationale that you've described, Justin, is what's on their mind. The idea that we need this 10, 15% of our base with us because, this is a 55-45 race. And if you don't have that 10, 15%, you don't get over 50. Okay. even if most of the GOP would come with us anyway, and so on and so on. But I think that it is rather confidence lacking, isn't it? That they don't think that they can rally those voters regardless. That that they really think that the power of some of these media personalities like Donald Trump and others is so strong that these voters are really going to stay home, that they won't be whipped up into a frenzy about something else. The Republican Party have had a lot of success at getting these sorts of voters very excited to come out and vote. And they've done it with and without Donald Trump, the host of The Apprentice, being involved in that effort. I think that there's a pretty compelling message that McCarthy and McConnell and the rest of the Republican apparatus could put forward, which is it's over. Trump accomplished these things that we celebrate, even if some of them are a little bogus. Take it for what it is. And now we're on to the next one. And then they spend the 2022 elections and 2024 elections talking about all the other things that excite the people they want to talk to. And another aspect of this is the conservative media infrastructure. And it's not a hive mind, neither is the GOP Congressional Caucus, but there are powerful institutional players here. Fox News went head to head against Newsmax and OANN and won. People are going to watch Fox more than those other channels. And the people who design the broadcast on Fox News have a lot of agency in the messages that they're communicating. And if Rupert Murdoch and was it Suzanne Scott, the new Roger Ailes, if they decided, look, we're ripping off the Band-Aid and we're going to push forward this McConnell-McCarthy message in a way that gets our audiences excited, and that was the editorial path that they took, they could have had a lot of success, I think. But they're too afraid to do so because they want to try to thread that needle.
I think that this is where we disagree. I think that, and really, a concerted in modern history now in American history since 2010, the extremism in the GOP party has been building and building and building to the point now where the tail wags the dog. I think that your hypothetical, like while a lot of Republicans, I truly believe, wish it were true. I know I wish it were true as a moderate Democrat here or a conservative Democrat, whatever you want to call me. But at the end of the day, people like to say politicians are dumb. That's the furthest from the truth. Politicians tend to be very smart, whether it's book smart, whether it's socially being able to read social cues, whether it be on an interpersonal level or of the sort. But they've all learned from John Boehner. They learned that back before the Trump movement was the Trump movement, Boehner stood up to the Tea Party and he lost his figurative head for it. He lost his job as speaker and then he lost his job. And then when Kevin McCarthy tried to take over right before Paul Ryan did, again, these freaks in the House Freedom Caucus, they blackmailed him. Walter Jones sent a letter blackmailing him, threatened to expose, allegedly, want to use proper language here, Walter Jones allegedly threatened to expose potential adultery between Kevin McCarthy and another member of Congress if Kevin McCarthy didn't drop out of the speaker race. So Kevin McCarthy drops out. And then you get Paul Ryan taking over, Steve Scalise, who's more conservative, McCarthy staying in the leader spot. So that is only to say that if they were to attempt to take your avenue, John, number one, I think that there would have been a sizable migration of these Fox viewers over to the kooks at wherever it is, Newsmax, OANN. I don't even know what those stations are. But also, Jim Jordan would be House Majority Leader right now. And it is very important that we all realize that Jim Jordan is as extreme as it gets, and he's the real major problem here. Because again, he thinks his constituents are idiots, and he's willing to use extreme, inflammatory, polarizing rhetoric, lie to them time and time again to whitewash Trump and to bring really his extreme view of the Republican Party to fruition. So at the end of the day, John, I think we'd have Speaker Jim Jordan. I think OANN or Newsmax or one of those channels would be much more popular. And maybe Mitch McConnell wouldn't be potentially Speaker in 2024. He'd probably be gone too, or 2022.
You mean Senate Leader? Yeah?
Senate Leader, sorry.
I'll say this. So just about whether it's the tail wagging the dog, we've talked about this before, but I would say it's the whole dog wagging all at once. Usually this question about top down versus bottom up, the answer is actually both. It's that these are feedback loops and permission structures, and that each is informing the other. That's how you get a cascading snowball effect. And that's sort of what's happening in the GOP. It's The audience tells the media what they want, and then the media gives it to the audience, and they build more expectations. And it's about building more and more and more demand for certain kinds of thought and behavior. But I want to clarify something. My argument is not that the GOP will not have extreme elements if they pursued a future without Donald Trump. I don't expect that at all. I'm describing a scenario in which there are plenty of extreme and crazy people, perhaps even leading the GOP, as you've suggested, people like Jim Jordan or others in the driver's seat. Sure, by counterfactual is about whether the GOP could move on from the specific person of Donald Trump, the television personality who tried to overthrow the US government. Because this isn't a question about whether the GOP are going to become like the Democrats. It's just about where the GOP draw the line, right? And so the GOP can have extreme elements and populist characters and people who have prejudices and the way that they communicate. The question is about whether there is space in there for people who try to violently overthrow the US government. You can have Ron DeSantis's and Jim Jordan's and so on right in the front seat of that car. The question is whether you're going to have Donald Trump in the front seat of that car, whether he really is a irreplaceable, untouchable personality. And they seem to think that he is. The question is about where they draw the line. And the thing is, if you do not draw the line at attempts to violently overthrow the US government, there is no line at all.
So hold on, though. I'm very confused here because when you mention Jim Jordan and others that voted to not certify the electors, but not only that, John, that played up the big lie in November, in December, and were literally folks like Mo Brooks, who may become a senator for Alabama, on the stage with President Trump prior to January 6th. I don't see there to be a line to be drawn. I see violent incitement, if not by the letter of the law. And folks, we're not talking the letter of the law. The intent was to mislead the Republic, to tell their voters that the election was stolen, and to create a frenzy. And that frenzy culminated with what happened on January 6th. So I see Jim Jordan as responsible. I see Mike Lee, Jim Jordan and Mike Lee responsible for the white collar crime. And then I see folks like Mo Brooks on that stage actually ginning up that anger. So how is there a difference between President Trump and what they did?
That's an excellent
Please
point. I was
defend Jim Jordan for me.
No. Well, I was sort of half thinking about that myself, actually, what you've just said, which is that if you do draw the line at violent insurrection, perhaps it would eliminate a particular person of Jim Jordan. I don't think that Ron DeSantis, as far as I know, would be eliminated if you're drawing the line at violent insurrection. I'm not aware of any involvement by the Florida governor in violent insurrection, although, perhaps I'll be proven wrong as these hearings play out. But, there's people that obviously can't meet that standard. Mark Meadows could not be part of a Republican Party that's intolerant of violent insurrection. Certainly. I mean, the evidence that we've seen already in media reporting demonstrates pretty clearly that he was central to these efforts, right? Rudy Giuliani cannot have a role in a GOP that's not tolerant of violent insurrection. Certainly not. About Jim Jordan, I'm not sure. I mean, certainly he was involved in some of the rhetorical encouragement.
Incitement?
Yeah. Yes, perhaps. How closely he was involved in the real mechanical and bureaucratic efforts that they were taking, efforts to install Jeffrey Clark as the AG, to try to pressure people who are overseeing elections in states like Georgia to fraudulate the votes. I don't know. And perhaps he was very closely involved in this. I don't know. I think we'll find out maybe more as these hearings unfold. Perhaps he would be eliminated by that standard.
And I just think most of the GOP is pathetic and weak. Not necessarily most of them are treasonous. I think there's a fair amount. But who wouldn't be thrown out under these metrics? So obviously Mitt Romney wouldn't be thrown out, who's very conservative. Tom Cotton wouldn't be thrown out, who Mitch McConnell was leaning on and relying upon. I believe it was January 5th to come out and say that he was not voting to overturn the election. So there are, and I can keep naming them. The female senator from West Virginia, Moore Capito, wouldn't be thrown out.
Most of the GOP Senate caucus.
The Senate caucus is relatively.
I think that there were fewer than 10 that actually voted to try to block the electoral vote count. I think it was 7 or something. Right?
Josh Hawley would be thrown out. John Kennedy would be thrown out. Yeah, it wasn't that many, but there were 140 members of the House. And here's the thing. You have legitimate members of the House, in my eyes, who don't believe this shit, like former chairman of the Agriculture Committee, former Senate House Finance Committee chairman, Frank Lucas. I sat across the table from him numerous times, negotiating on farm bill issues. He's a statesman. He's eloquent. He absolutely deplored Jim Lankford at the time because he thought Jim Lankford was too conservative. Jim Lankford didn't pull this insurrection shit. But you had Frank Lucas vote to not certify the electors in the House. So I guess that leads me to my next thing. In the Republican Party, you have Trump, violent insurrectionist. You have Jim Jordan, probably a violent insurrectionist. Then you have folks who, bunch of others with Jim Jordan, Mike Lee, who worked behind the scenes to overturn things, Ted Cruz, who's a despicable human being, really just the probably part of the worst that humanity can offer. But then you have another realm of Republicans in here, John, that are literally very respectable, that claim to love the country. I've believed them to love the country, but they voted this way anyways. So when we're looking at the GOP, I say the party's rotten to its core because you have racists like Ron Johnson and others. How should we view the maybe 100 members in the House that voted not to certify the election, but maybe they don't believe it, and behind closed doors, they talk about how awful it is? Are they gone, or how do I understand this?
It's a very difficult question. I mean, what it really requires us to do is really interpret what that vote means. And I think that that's probably a whole another hour-long conversation that we could have. I don't know if we're really prepared to do a thorough enough job at that right now. I'm sure that plenty of members of Congress can at least attempt to hide behind the plausible deniability of there have been performative rhetorical votes not to count the Electoral College votes on other occasions. And we only meant this as a political message. I think that there's certainly degrees of credibility in that explanation. Certainly any member of Congress who is also at the same time trying to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the Electoral College votes, they're taking it a step further than that, and so on and so on. I think that this is part of the utility of votes. It is that it really does put the members on the record, right? And we saw this with the impeachment. I mean, if there had not been impeachment votes of Donald Trump, there were two. If there hadn't been any, then many Republicans would have carried on with the way that they were attempting to position themselves before those votes and say, I don't even really support Donald Trump. You don't even know if I support Donald Trump. Right? I'll vote with him on the issues that I agree, which is most of them, and I'll criticize his conduct and his tweets, and I'll, walk the line that way. And there's an ambiguity about whether that member even wants Trump in the White House. And it's a comfortable ambiguity because you can project on it whatever you like. When you're actually counted and you're called on to say, would you like this person to continue as president or not? Which is what happened in those two impeachment votes. And we know where you stand. And I think that that's the utility of these kinds of votes. And the vote that you're alluding to is another vote that certainly tells us something. Again, I think that there's different ways of interpreting it. And the most uncharitable one might indeed be the most appropriate one, which is that these were people who really betrayed their responsibilities to the United States, right? And that might indeed, like I said, that might indeed be the appropriate way of interpreting how they behaved. And just like you said, Justin, many people who were in that position probably never expected to be. But it goes back to kind of what I was describing, which was this lack of confidence. These are members who do not believe that they can stand on their genuine principles and prevail. They believe that the insurrectionists are much more powerful than they are, and that they can't convince their own constituents that they did the right thing. That in fact, their constituents might want them to do the wrong thing. It brings us back to questions of what leadership and representation even are. Are you meant to be a pure proxy of the majority will in your district as you understand it? Or do you, as an elected representative, have some separate responsibility to, in fact, lead the people that you're representing and try to convince them of what's right and represent them in the way that you think best suits their real interests? I think that these are different theories at play. And these members who are so afraid of the insurrectionists and think they're so much stronger than them that they can't survive rebuking them, they sort of have been proven wrong, haven't they? Because the U.S. system did indeed prevail after January 6th, not to the full extent that it should have, eliminating this person, Donald Trump, from ever holding office again. It did not do that. But it did allow the rightfully elected president to take office and for the business of the government to continue and for the U.S. constitutional system to live another day. So it does make you ask whether their belief about who's strong and who's weak is indeed accurate at all.
Yeah, and I'm going to answer this question that I proposed to you. Again, I think that there are extremists like Trump and Jim Jordan. I think that there are people maybe a little bit less extreme, but equally horrible. And then I think there are about 100 of the 140 members that voted to not certify the election that don't really believe this stuff. They were just doing it to be partisans. And on the Democratic side in 2016, it was very different back then. They weren't saying that the election is fraudulent, but you had Jim McGovern, you had Jamie Raskin, you had Pramila Jayapal, you had Raul Grijalva, you had Sheila Jackson Lee, Barbara Lee, Maxine Waters, all vote to not certify different states. And I find it undemocratic. I find it disgusting. I find it despicable. I find it an act of polarization that these Democrats, some of them in leadership positions, chairman of and chairwoman of committee, the head of the Progressive Caucus, would go so far to object to different votes that weren't rigged, that there was no stolen election. So I do think that no matter who you are, if you are making a vote like this to satisfy the worst of your party, to gain electoral favor, to use performative art to say that our elections are not fair, I think you're disgusting, and it's a question of whether or not you're fit to serve. That's my opinion. Democrat or Republican, I'm consistent, and I vote on this stuff, John. So that's the answer. I don't think they're evil like the others. I don't think they're necessarily criminally inept like potentially Jim Jordan. But I do think that we have to question whether or not they're fit to serve.
You're talking about the people who voted to object in 2016 to the electoral vote.
Anyone that votes to object to any electoral vote.
I think
it's not equivalent, but I think it's.
I understand what you're saying. I think the context is.
Do you hear the names on that list? For the most part, they're extreme.
Certainly not.
Maxine Waters, Barbara Lee, Sheila Jackson Lee, Jayapal. These are not like your
Jamie Raskin, right?
Jamie Raskin, Jim McGovern
is extreme. But what I would say is that the context is very significant in that just like
we're gonna have to cut this part.
Justin, yeah,
we're gonna have to cut that part.
Fully cut that part. Should we just end now?
Yeah. We should just cut that. I don't know how good this is, dude.
I mean, I was getting.
Should we listen? I thought it was scattered. I just thought it was scattered. I thought it was scattered. I think we're going to need to definitely cut the last part and then listen. I'm going to have to do a listen to it again because I don't think there was any like coherence to it.
I
mean, we didn't make any real points.
I was pretty happy with some of the points I was making.
I don't know. I didn't think any of it was good, but so cut the last part. Anything else that we should cut?
Yeah, we could.
I'm not going to be able to interview I'm not going to be able to interview a Republican again if we publish this.
Oh no, that's not how it works. They want to be on media.
All right.
But I was going to say, yeah, we could end right after the part about how the system carried on to fight another day. That could be a good place for it to end.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I was flowing well. I wasn't saying and I was talking fast, but I mean, aside from open contempt for the Republican Party, I don't think either of us made any real great revolutionary points.
There's some interesting stuff in there.
This is still not uploaded. Jeff, can you?
Yeah, I'm waiting for it to upload.
Because he's still recording it.
Is he there?